You're sitting in a classroom, or maybe a meeting room, or maybe alone at your desk at 11 p.m., and someone explains something, a concept, an idea, a theory, and you nod. You genuinely nod. It feels right. It clicks. You think, yes, I understand that. And then 3 days later, someone asks you to explain it, and you open your mouth, and nothing comes out. Not because you forgot, but because, and this is the unsettling part, you never actually understood it in the first place. You understood the feeling of understanding, which is an entirely different thing. Here's what most people believe about intelligence: that some people are simply born with more of it, that geniuses are built differently, that the brain you have at 20 is largely the brain you'll die with, faster in some, slower in others, but fundamentally fixed. Here's what the science actually says. That belief is not just wrong, it is actively keeping you from thinking better. And today, we're going to dismantle it, carefully and without rushing. Illusion versus reality. There's a concept in psychology called fluency illusion. It's the feeling that because something is familiar, you must understand it. You've read the chapter, you've watched the video, you've listened to the podcast, and somewhere in that exposure, your brain quietly filed it under known. Not understood, just known. This is where most learning dies, not in laziness, not in lack of effort, but in the comfortable, convincing warmth of recognition mistaken for comprehension. Jean Piaget, the Swiss psychologist who spent decades watching children learn, had a name for the mental structures we use to interpret the world. He called them schemas. And here's what he discovered. When new information fits neatly into an old schema, we simply absorb it, assimilate it. We don't change. The idea just gets folded into what we already believe. But real learning, real cognitive growth, that requires accommodation. It requires your existing schema to crack, to reshape, to become something it wasn't before. And here's the uncomfortable truth. That process feels like confusion, not clarity. Which means, and stay with this, when you feel confused, you are not failing to learn. You are in the middle of learning. Your brain is restructuring. The discomfort is the restructuring. Most people flee that feeling. They reach for the summary, the shortcut, the multiple choice version. And in doing so, they protect their ego and starve their mind. Psychological tension. Let's talk about something that doesn't get enough attention in conversations about intelligence: emotional resistance. Because here's what happens when you genuinely don't understand something. Your identity gets a little threatened. There's a quiet internal voice that says, maybe I'm just not good at this. And to protect yourself from that conclusion, you avoid the deep engagement that would actually prove it wrong. This is what psychologists call ego-protective cognition. We stop asking the next question, not because we're incurious, but because curiosity taken far enough reveals gaps, and gaps feel dangerous. But what if we reframed that entirely? Lev Vygotsky, a Russian psychologist working in the early 20th century whose ideas were so radical his government suppressed them, introduced a concept he called the zone of proximal development. The space between what you can do alone and what you can do with the right support, the right challenge, the right friction. He believed that growth only happens inside that zone, not below it. That's just repetition. Not above it. That's just overwhelm. But inside the tension, in the productive difficulty. Mistakes, then, are not evidence of inadequacy. They are the mechanism of expansion. They are your ZPD showing itself. Every time you get something wrong, your brain has a choice: defend the old schema or crack it open. And which one you choose, that, more than any IQ test ever written, determines how intelligent you will become. Core concept teaching. The Feynman principle. Here is the central idea I want you to hold. I'm going to give it to you in the simplest way I know how. Richard Feynman, Nobel Prize-winning physicist, one of the clearest thinkers of the 20th century, had a learning rule so simple it almost sounds insulting. If you can't explain something in plain language, you don't understand it yet. That's it. That's the whole thing. Not do you recognize it, not can you pass a test about it, but can you explain it, out loud, simply to someone who has never heard of it without using jargon as a hiding place. Because jargon is very often where understanding goes to pretend it exists. Think about it like this. Imagine your understanding is a map. Most people draw a map of a city they've never visited based on photographs, based on other maps, based on vibes. And the map looks right. The streets are in roughly the right place. The neighborhoods seem plausible. But then someone asks you to navigate, and you discover that your map has gaps where there should be roads, bridges over rivers that don't connect, landmarks that were just decorations, not actual knowledge. The Feynman technique, explaining things from scratch in your own words until the gaps scream at you, is how you find the missing roads. You don't find them by rereading the map, you find them by trying to walk it. This is also why writing works so much better than highlighting, why teaching someone else accelerates your own learning, why the students who ask the dumbest-seeming questions are often the ones with the most accurate self-knowledge, because they haven't filled their gaps with borrowed vocabulary. Clarity is not a gift, it is a practice.
Identity expansion. Now, I want to gently ask you something. How do you think about your own intelligence? Because I think many of us, more than we admit, operate from a silent assumption that we've been sorted, that somewhere around adolescence the world gave us a rough score, good at math, bad at languages, creative but not analytical, smart but not wise, and we've been living inside that sorting ever since. Carol Dweck, the Stanford psychologist, calls this a fixed mindset, the belief that your qualities are carved, not grown. And what she found, across decades of research, is that this belief is self-fulfilling. Not because the brain is fixed, it isn't, but because when you believe it is, you stop doing the things that change it. Here is the shift I'm asking you to consider. Mastery is not a destination you either reach or don't. Mastery is a disposition. It is the practice of staying curious past the point where most people get comfortable. It is the willingness to be wrong out loud, without that meaning anything about who you are. The people we call geniuses, the Einsteins, the Darwins, the Curies, were not distinguished, first, by their outputs. They were distinguished by their relationship with not knowing, by a kind of intellectual stubbornness that refused to accept "I think I understand" as a stopping point. Einstein spent 10 years sitting with a question about what it would feel like to ride alongside a beam of light. 10 years of not knowing. And from that discomfort, patiently held, not fled, came the special theory of relativity. What if intelligence isn't something you have? What if it's something you practice, through deliberate confusion, through honest questions, through the willingness to rebuild your schemas from the ground up? What would you be willing to not understand for long enough to actually understand it? Transformational insight. Here's where something interesting happens. When you start to genuinely adopt this way of thinking, when confusion becomes a compass instead of a threat, something changes in how you see problems. Problems stop being obstacles, they start being information. Every stuck place becomes a map of your next growth edge. Every misunderstanding becomes an invitation to build a more accurate model of reality. This isn't motivational language, this is cognitive science. Piaget's notion of disequilibrium, that moment when the world doesn't behave the way your schema predicted, is not a malfunction, it is the engine of cognitive development. Children don't learn to walk by succeeding. They learn by falling, recalibrating, and trying again, thousands of times with total unself-consciousness.
Somewhere between childhood and adulthood, we lose that unself-consciousness. We start protecting our image of ourselves as already knowing people. And the tragedy isn't that we stop learning. The tragedy is we don't notice that we've stopped. But here's the gift inside this realization. The moment you see it, it dissolves. The moment you understand that confusion is not failure, but mechanism, the defense comes down. The ego loosens its grip. You become just slightly more available to reality as it actually is, rather than as your current schema insists it must be. And that availability, that softness toward uncertainty, is, I would argue, the closest thing to genius that any of us can actually cultivate. Not a higher IQ, not a better memory, not faster processing speed. A more honest relationship with what you do and do not know. That is the lever. That is what changes everything. Reflective ending. There's a question I keep returning to. I want to leave it with you. Not as a challenge, not as homework, just as something to sit with. What if the most intelligent thing you could do today, right now, is to find one thing you believe you understand and ask yourself whether you could explain it to a 10-year-old? Not to prove that you can, but to find out whether you can't. Because that gap, the one between feeling like you know something and actually knowing it, is not a source of shame. It is the most honest, most productive, most human place you can stand. Vygotsky believed that we think better in the presence of others who challenge us. Piaget believed that growth lives in the crack between what we expect and what we encounter. Feynman believed that the truth has no patience for the appearance of understanding. And somewhere between these three ideas is a picture of a mind that is not smarter than yours, but more honest than most of ours. You were not born with a fixed intelligence. You were born with the capacity to restructure, to recalibrate, to rebuild your model of reality every single time reality surprises you. The question is simply, will you let it surprise you? Or will you keep nodding comfortably, convincingly, expertly, while the deeper understanding waits, just one honest question away? End card. If this shifted something for you, even quietly, share it with someone who needs it. And if you have a question you've been afraid to ask out loud, ask it in the comments. That might be the most important thing you do today.